Hello again. Welcome to the Keystone Cannabis Conversation. I'm Joe Cringer,
I'm Jerry Feister.
and we're taking you back to basics today. We have a little history lesson for you. Whether you believe it or not, whether you realize it or not, the cannabis plant has a long-known history that's been recorded. Many cultures and societies throughout the world have used cannabis for its nutritional and its healing powers and medicinal powers. Its prohibition, especially in America, the history of its prohibition is actually rather recent. So we're going to bring you up to speed on some of those facts today and catch you up on the history of cannabis.
Yeah, dating back as far as 2900 BC, cannabis has been widely used for medical reasons in cultures like the Chinese and Egyptian cultures. For these same reasons, it was used and recognized so well for treating these conditions throughout the world that it was actually on the U.S. pharmacopoeia.
That's right. And cannabis has a very deep-rooted past in the United States. It was actually grown and sold as a pharmaceutical here all the way until the 1930s. Things took a radical turn at this time and drastically altered the way cannabis was perceived in American culture.
In 1930, a gentleman by the name of Harry Anslinger was appointed to a newly formed organization called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. When he was appointed to this campaign, he immediately wanted to prohibit cannabis. It began to use scare tactics and propaganda to put fear into citizens' minds for smoking this, that it would cause you to go insane. They also claimed that it forced people to commit serious crimes, and more particularly associated these negative actions with minority groups such as African Americans and Mexicans.
A man by the name of William Randolph Hearst then added fuel to the American propaganda fire. Hearst was a printing press tycoon who owned a large majority of the country's printing presses and newspapers. Cannabis posed a serious threat to his business model because of its use as also potentially making fiber and paper in the United States. So Hearst began to print stories in his newspapers that replaced the word cannabis with the slang term marijuana. And he spread and continued to spread lies of its danger and the dangers that it posed to the American society throughout his papers and news presses. Propaganda then went mainstream after that, and many might recall the outrageous cult classic film called Reefer Madness, which totally inaccurately portrayed people smoking cannabis joints and instantly experiencing manic episodes.
The Marijuana Tax Act, which was passed on August 2nd, 1937, led to a sharp decline in cannabis prescriptions and effectively resulted in the prohibition of cannabis. In the attempt to remove all traces of its medical benefits, cannabis was even removed from the U.S. pharmacopoeia in 1942.
The real criminalization of cannabis possession really began to ramp up throughout the 50s and 60s from there. Harsh minimum prison sentences were imposed on those caught with possession of cannabis. This all laid the groundwork for prohibition of cannabis on a federal level then.
Right. In 1970, the Controlled Substance Act labeled cannabis as a dangerous drug that had no medical uses. Until this day, it still remains as a Class 1 or a Scheduled 1 drug.
That's where the hypocrisy really began for the United States government, and they constantly contradicted themselves time and time again in their position on cannabis and the acceptance of cannabis in American culture. In the 70s, the government declared a war on drugs, cannabis, of course, being at the top of that list. Meanwhile, a federal court ruled that Robert Randolph's use of cannabis for his glaucoma was of a medical necessity. In the late 70s, the federal government even started a program that supplied a limited number of patients with cannabis joints.
Measures like this were what initiated the reemergence about the truth of medical cannabis and its real medical purposes. Despite countless pleas throughout the 80s and 90s, from patients and grassroots advocacy groups like NORML to deschedule cannabis, it still remains a Scheduled 1 drug.
Through those types of unified efforts across America, though, and support for medical cannabis especially gained widely throughout the United States. And cannabis scored its first mainstream victory when Proposition 215 was passed by California voters, making it the first state to essentially re-legalize cannabis for its medical uses in America.
And they really started the trend 2 years later. In 1998, there was Alaska, Oregon, and Washington that became the second, third, and fourth states to legalize medical cannabis. And by the year 2000, 8 states in total have now passed medical cannabis legislation.
Fast forward just another 16 years, and we've recently hit the tipping point in American cannabis history, as 25 states now in America have passed medical cannabis laws, including Pennsylvania and Ohio, who did it this year. People's perceptions are changing after over 50 years of prohibition of cannabis, and the false stigmas that formerly surrounded cannabis are slowly beginning to lift.
Not only did Pennsylvania legalize medical cannabis this year, but 3 major cities within the Commonwealth, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Harrisburg, have also decriminalized possession of small amounts of marijuana. More cities are considering the same throughout the state, and all of this is thanks to the advocacy efforts of all the advocacy groups. So if you would like to get behind the movement, reach out to your local municipalities, talk to them, start the conversation about learning about decriminalizing small amounts of marijuana.
Since the early 2000s, American culture has seen a steady shift in acceptance of cannabis use, especially more and more legitimate research which reveals the true efficacy of medical cannabis for a number of conditions.
As we said, despite much continued public outcry and the fact that the government now owns a patent on the therapeutic uses of cannabinoids as antioxidants, there's still been no change in rescheduling. As more states continue to allow legalization to medical cannabis, it allows more research to be done on the real benefits of it.
It's important to know this history of cannabis too, because for thousands of years, humans and cannabis coexisted on this planet. And cannabis has only been prohibited for about 70 or 80 years. That short time of its prohibition was based entirely on lies, ignorance, and propaganda, and now the truth is finally resurfacing. Knowledge is power in this fight, so learning the truth, like this history, understanding it, and continuing to spread these messages will hopefully help effectively end the negative perception we've attached to cannabis for the last 80 years.
We appreciate you guys tuning in. We hope you gain some knowledge on the history of cannabis throughout the country and within Pennsylvania here, and we are glad to see you next time on the Keystone Cannabis Conversation.
Please email us with any questions you might have. KeystoneCompassionate@gmail.com. Thanks again for tuning in and sharing this video with anybody else who's interested in the history of cannabis or cannabis in general. See you next time.